Processing of timber. Processing is a stage a raw material will undergo to become a finished product. The entire stages involved in the processing of timber can be summarized in the chart shown in your screen. Now let's look at each of the items on the chart one by one. First, felling of trees. Processing of timber begins with the felling of and cutting trees down into logs of wood. This can be done in personal or communal owned forests known as free areas. It can also be done in government owned tree plantations. These are known as forest reserves. Tree felling is usually done with either an axe for small trees, or we can use a chainsaw for the larger trees. The age of trees for felling varies from 50 to 100 years. After felling, the logs are transported to the sawmill where conversion takes place. And that will bring us to the next item and the topic, which is conversion of timber. What is conversion of timber? This is the process of sawing or splitting logs of timber into commercial or marketable sizes. The common trade names for sawn timber include 1. Log. This is a trunk of wood with branches cut off. 2. Plank. These are pieces of wood that measures 38 mm to 100 mm thick and 150 mm or over wide. 3. Boards. These are pieces of timber that measure 10 mm to 38 mm thick and 75 mm and over wide. 4. Battens. These are pieces of timber that measure 19 mm to 38 mm thick and from 25 mm to 75 mm wide. 5. Strips. These are pieces of timber that less than 19 mm thick and up to 75 mm wide. 6. Molding. These are shaped timbers which can be planks, board, strips, etc. Now let's look at the methods of conversion of timber. There are two methods of conversion of timber. These are plain sawing and quarter sawing. Plain sawing. This is the process of sawing or splitting logs of timber along parallel lines through and through. It is also known as tangential sawing. Many timber operators prefer this method because it is a simple, quick, and cheap way of converting logs into planks suited for various purposes. There are some advantages as well as disadvantages of using this method of sawing. Advantages of plain sawing. 1. It helps to minimize the waste of wood. 2. The planks produced through this method are fairly strong when used for floor joists. 3. The planks produced by this method dry up quickly. Now let's see some of the disadvantages of plain sawing. 1. Plain sawn timbers do not always retain their original shape. 2. They tend to warp as they shrink or swell. And now we're going to look at the second method of conversion of timber, and that is quarter sawing. This is a method of wood conversion in which the splitting planes project roughly outwards from the center in the radial direction, that is, cutting along the medullary rays. The angle required for effective sawing should not be less than 45 degrees. Now let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of quarter sawing. Advantages: 1. The planks produced through quarter sawing are more stable than plain sawn timber. 2. They do not check or split like plain sawn timber. 3. They shrink less, and as such, they are useful for high-class cabinet making, door frames, window sashes, etc. And then disadvantages of quarter sawing: it requires more attention, and 2, it wastes wood and is also an expensive way of splitting logs. And with this, we are going to take the next item, which is seasoning of timber. What is seasoning of timber? This is a process of reducing the moisture content from freshly converted timber. Timber cannot be used for construction or carpentry work immediately after the felling or cutting of trees, because the trees contain about 50% or more of its own dry weight as water. If excess moisture is present in the timber, then it will shrink excessively. It will also have a tendency to decay. Green wood, that is fresh wood, is prone to decay, warp, or even bend when it dries. Hence, there is the need for seasoning the timber before construction. What are the reasons why timber should be seasoned? 1. To make the wood stronger. 2. To make the wood more durable. 3. To make the wood resistant to weather and insect attacks. 4. To reduce the weight of the wood. 5. To avoid shrinkage and warp after use. 6. To make it easier for the wood to take paint, polish, and preservatives. 7. To make sawing and planing of timber easier. 8. To keep the wood free from corroding metals, screws, bolts, and nuts. 9. To impact hardness, stiffness, strength, and better electrical resistance to timber. Now, after we're done with seasoning of timber, we move on to methods of seasoning timber. There are basically two methods in which timber can be seasoned. These are: 1. Natural seasoning. 2. Artificial seasoning. Natural seasoning is also known as air drying. It involves the process of exposing the wood to air and sunlight. The seasoning of timber is carried out by natural air. Hence, it is also referred to as air seasoning. The timber pieces are stacked either horizontally or vertically in such a way that there is sufficient gap between the sections for air to pass through. The stack is covered with a roof and timber is left to dry. The planks are arranged on a beam or stacked to allow free circulation of air. The stack can either be in the open air or under a roof. However, the planks should be raised high enough to keep the bottom of the stacked boards off the ground. Advantages of natural seasoning: it is relatively cheap and it requires little attention. Disadvantages of natural seasoning: the speed of drying is very slow and insects may attack and destroy the wood. I will look at the next method, which is artificial seasoning. This method is also known as kiln drying. It is carried out in a regulated oven. The timber is stacked in an enclosed compartment or chamber where the temperature, humidity, and air circulation can be controlled. The heated air makes the moisture rapidly evaporate from the surface of the timber. The time required for this type of seasoning is 3 to 12 days. There are some advantages and disadvantages of this method too. And let's see the advantages of artificial seasoning. 1. It is faster than natural seasoning. And 2. It produces timber with desirable moisture content for specific use. Disadvantages. 1. It is more expensive than natural seasoning. And 2. It requires skill and attention as the timber could be easily burnt off. And now this brings us to the moisture content of timber. Moisture content of timber is an indication of the weight of moisture or water in a piece of timber. That means it tells us how wet the timber is. It can be obtained as follows. That is, moisture content can be calculated with the formula WWW minus WDW all over WDW times 100%, where the moisture content is represented with MC, and then WWW stands for the weight of wet wood, as well as WDW stands for the weight of dry wood. It should be noted that the moisture content of wood is usually expressed as a percentage of the dry weight. Now we're going to take some examples of how to actually find out the moisture content in wood with a simple calculation. 1. A sample of wood weighs 120 grams before seasoning and 100 grams after seasoning. Calculate the percentage of moisture content in the wood. Now let's see the solution. First, we're going to list out the items present in the question. The weight of the wet wood is 120 grams. The weight of the dry wood is 100 grams. The moisture content is calculated with the formula that we gave previously, and that is WWW minus WDW times 100 over 1 all over WDW. If we apply that, we're going to have 120 grams minus 100 grams over 100 times 100%. And when we subtract, we're going to have 20 grams times 100% all over 100. And finally, working on that, we give us the moisture content as 20%. Now let's see the conclusion of what we have learned in this module. We have come to the end of the lesson for this module, and briefly can highlight some of the major points from the module. Processing of timber begins with felling of trees, and then conversion of timber is the process of cutting trees into commercial or marketable sizes using either the plain or quarter sawing method. And then seasoning of timber is the processing or reducing of the moisture content from freshly converted timbers. There is natural and artificial method of seasoning timber, and I hope you've enjoyed the lesson. See you again in the next module. Have a nice day.